This lesson continues with all the drama surrounding Jacob and Esau, but before we get started, we're going to be using a different translation today. This is called the Net Bible, and its best value lies in its extensive notes. They're very technical at times, but like anything else, you have to keep a sharp eye out for bias and sectarianism. And of course, it uses the Masoretic text for the Old Testament. I think there at least was a Net's Bible with an S for Septuagint, but I haven't been able to find it lately. So I don't know if they discontinued that or what, but still the notes are very valuable. So let's get right into, we left off about verse 10 of chapter 28 in Genesis, and this is the account of Jacob's dream of seeing a stairway reaching into the sky, which was the picture at the start, the thumbnail image, with angels descending and ascending on it, and God himself was standing at the top as he saw it. And then God repeats to Jacob the blessing that had been given to Abraham and Isaac, his grandfather and father. And we see there the phrase, the ground you're lying on, and there's just no way to take that other than literal. Also, the references to the four compass points and the families of the earth, that's all talking about this world. So notice also there's a note 23, if I can find that to click on, and it pops up on the right side there. How the Hebrew, and incidentally the Greek does this as well, at least in this point, expresses all these things in a much more engaging terms than what's typically considered a technically accurate translation. Ancient historians put the reader into the scene, whereas most English translators tend to make it as dry and boring as possible, in what I think is a misguided effort to achieve technical accuracy. There's nothing harming accuracy if you paint a picture for the reader. That's the whole point of language, is to communicate. And sometimes this is better done, as we know from watching movies, that you can get a lot more information in a shorter time. If you've ever read a novel that was later put into movie form, you know that sometimes a novel can spend 5 or 6 pages just painting a scene for you, whereas in a video you can just see it. There it is. Now that takes away some imagination, but at the same time, if it's information you're just conveying, painting a picture is a good way to do that. So that's something that's lost in the translation. Now back to the text. Jacob, for some reason, had not yet formally accepted his father's God, so he decided that if the journey went well for him, then he would make that his God too, his grandfather and father's God. And this is where he says that just before chapter 29. So it's possible, per the first note on the next chapter that we'll see, that Jacob stole his brother's blessing because he was trying to get it by his own efforts rather than accepting and trusting his father's God. So we all automatically think when we read these accounts that he was already a follower of the one true God, but that's not necessarily true. So the point is that we sometimes wonder, why would a person like that do this, that, and the other? And the answer is often we assume something that wasn't really warranted, that he was already a follower of God. Whereas, some of the explanation for why he did certain things was because he wasn't. So notice also that he vows to give a tenth. I think I went a little bit past that. And once again, we ask, is this a command for all people for all time to tithe, since it predates the laws of Moses? And as we noted before in the account of Abraham giving Melchizedek a tenth of the plunder of war, nothing is said here about a continual practice or that it would be binding on the wages of all his descendants. So we just need to keep that in mind. Someone may, as they often do, use such things as proof texts to impose tithing on the church because it's outside the laws of Moses. So let's go on to chapter 29. And if we remember that Jacob knew his brother was waiting for the chance to kill him, the encounter with God certainly did change his life at that point. So his frame of mind is quite different now than it had been. And then this is pivotal timing because he's about to meet his future wife, Rachel, who incidentally was tending sheep. It says that people think only men were shepherds then, but women did too. And he's overjoyed to meet her because she's the answer to his prayers. And then she runs home to tell her father, Laban, who rushes out to meet him because they were in the habit of going to their father's or relatives' clans. So Jacob had spent a month in Laban's household. Then he was invited there, and he stuck around for a month, and during which time he fell in love with Rachel. But she had an older sister named Leah, and the custom was for the older daughter to be married before the younger. But Laban neglects to tell any of this to Jacob, who accepts his offer of working for him for 7 years and then being given Rachel as his wife. Laban is deliberately deceiving and defrauding Jacob because he has no intention of marrying off Rachel before Leah. So this is what I meant in an earlier lesson where I said that this was a conniving person and that we would hear about him later, and here we are. And so let me skip ahead there in the text. And Jacob finds out 7 years later that Laban was messing with him, just being very deceitful. So this is what we would call today a bait and switch. I mean, Laban, evidently, it was dark when it was time for him to be given when Jacob was to be given his wife, and he didn't know it wasn't Rachel until the next morning when he had already married her. So, verse 30, if we can go down to that, is where it says that though Jacob grudgingly agrees to work 7 more years to get Rachel, he gets her at the end of what was called the bridal week for Leah, so he didn't have to wait another 7 years for Rachel. He has to wait 7 days. But it was because he had been defrauded, but still, it wasn't right for Laban to do that. And to require him to work 7 years, he waited 7 years for Rachel and then slipped Leah instead. So we're already having issues with this family. And, of course, when this sort of thing goes on, we're all thinking to ourselves, what could go wrong? It's just fraught with potential for everything to go wrong, and it pretty much will, as we'll see. And verse 30 also tells us that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. And just like the bad parenting 101 that we learned about in the account of his parents, this is another disaster waiting to happen. In our culture and time, we might wonder why such problems weren't more common, since men often slept with concubines as servants as well, as we've already seen, and often with the blessing of their wives. But we should also remember that God often tolerates what he never intended or ordained and lets us deal with the consequences of our choices. God doesn't have the habit of reaching down from heaven and yanking people into line when they're about to do something stupid or they've got ridiculous customs that only lead to trouble. And as I said, it's amazing that there wasn't more trouble given those kind of customs. But as if things aren't bad enough already, with the favorite wife and all that, God intervenes on behalf of less loved Leah by making her fertile and Rachel barren. Leah's first 4 sons would turn out to be the heads of tribes to be known eventually as the tribes of Israel, and 2 of them would be especially the subject of later covenants. That would be Levi and Judah. And that's the under this heading they have here, the family of Jacob. So now we're going to get into chapter 30 here. And shockingly, Rachel gets jealous. We didn't see that coming, did we? So she demands children from Jacob, who again, shockingly, asks her if she thinks he's God or something. So, in a familiar move with predictable results, she decides to solve the problem by having her servant bear children for her. Where have we seen that before? And thus were born the heads of the tribes of Dan and Naphtali. So then begins round 2 of the sister feud. Leah, who by this time had stopped having children, decides to have them through her servant, who gives birth to the future tribal heads Gad and Asher. And I think I've gotten a little behind on the text here. So it's just mushrooming, these problems. And verse 14 there starts a section that makes no sense to us today, that somehow mandrake plants could make women fertile. Coincidence or not, the sisters wheel and deal over them, and Leah conceives again and gives birth to Issachar and Zebulun. Now, her last child would be a girl named Dinah, who we'll see later in later lessons, turn out to be the catalyst of some bloodshed and other serious problems later on. Now, after all those babies from Leah and her servant, God decides to have pity on Rachel, and she gives birth to Joseph, who will turn out to save their entire clan from extinction. One more son will come from Rachel later on, but first the text turns to the matter of tension between Jacob and Laban on the occasion of his completing the second set of 7 years of work. And we go down here to verse 25. But Laban wants to keep him around because he realizes that he has only become wealthier due to God blessing Jacob. So Jacob agrees to stay, but he has an ulterior motive, a plan to benefit from Laban's greed per note number 84. So let me find, they've had this discussion about what should we do next, and wanted to go down here to verse just before verse 39, and it explains some things about the branches and their thoughts on that. But his plot is to outwit his father-in-law through prenatal conditioning of the flock by visual aids, and yet he will still attribute the success of this to God. So at least he has that, and we can see that he's kind of a changed man by now because of that earlier encounter. But he does have a plan to at least keep the crops or the herds separate, the flocks, so that they don't get mixed up, and so they know whose is whose. But at the same time, this is going to work out to his advantage. So now we'll go down to chapter 31. And at this point, Laban's sons see how it's mainly Jacob who is getting richer, and they turn Laban against him. So God tells Jacob to return to his homeland, and this is where we find out what else has been going on all this time. Laban has changed Jacob's wages 10 times and made a fool out of him. So in spite of everything, even so, Jacob credits God for his success and not his own conniving. So again, we're saying this is him as a changed man. Now, it takes Laban 3 days to even notice that Jacob has left. And let me skip down the text here for that. I think I'm about in the right area. But as soon as he finds out, Laban gets an army mustered from his clan and he goes after Jacob. But when he catches up to him, God appears to Laban and says, "Don't you do anything." So instead, he has this shouting match with Jacob, but Jacob knew nothing about the stolen idols, which I didn't mention, but you can read about in the text that Rachel stole her father's idols before she left. But Jacob didn't know anything about it, and he allowed a search to be done. Nothing was found, but Rachel kept them concealed in an ingenious way. You could see down in verse 35. So she said, "Sorry, I can't get up right now." And that's where she had them hidden. Nobody thought to ask, but they weren't going to. It was just too socially awkward. So the shouting match continues in verse 36 until they finally call an uneasy truce down in verse 45. And Laban returns to his home then. But we're not out of the woods yet. So Jacob continues his travels, and along the way God appears to him again, but he knows he will have to deal with his brother Esau, because that's the direction he's heading. He's going back home. So he decides to send messengers ahead to try and soften him up. But when they return from the mission with the news that Esau is coming for them with a force of 400 men, As a precaution, Jacob divides his people into two camps so that if one is attacked, the other will escape. And then, of course, he prays to God for protection. And sometimes this thing skips on me and I don't know what it's doing, so I couldn't tell you right now what chapter we're even. Okay, 37. That went a little farther than I expected. Sorry about that. We were back in chapter 32, so we'll try to get back up there. That's one thing about this website, it's a little squirrely. I don't know why it did that. So anyway, God appears to Jacob, wherever we were in the text on that. And Jacob divides the people up into two camps. So he's still trying to appease Esau, but he decides to also send ahead a gift of many animals, but he divides them up into various herds of different types of animals and tells his servants to keep distance between them. So one servant will come with a bunch of animals and say this is a gift, and then the next one will come. And he's hoping that by a string of gifts like that, that it might help soften Esau up some more. In the meantime, while they're off doing that, he sends his family and possessions to another place so he would face his brother alone, so his family might have a chance to escape. But then let's go down to verse 24. So Jacob's alone, and this is where we find that very curious story about the fact that during the night, some mysterious man comes to him and starts wrestling and fighting with him, and they wrestle all night long until almost daybreak. But the man couldn't win, so it was a stalemate. So he struck one of Jacob's hip sockets and dislocated it. This might be the first recorded case of sandbagging. I mean, serious sandbagging, because obviously this mystery man could have won any time he wanted. But he finally ended it, and even so, the man asked Jacob to let him go, which I don't understand. I don't think anybody does, but he was like in a hurry to go because it was becoming daytime. But Jacob responds with a curious request for a blessing without even knowing who this was, because at this point he doesn't know who this is. But instead of giving a blessing, the man asks Jacob his name and then changes it to Israel. This is where the name comes from, Israel, and which means God fights. So Jacob then asks the man who he is, but the man finally blesses him, and only then does Jacob realize that this was God appearing in human form. And of course, the timing of this must certainly be because he's about to meet Esau. At any rate, we make note that Jacob's name has been changed, although the text still refers to him as Jacob for a while after this. So this chapter 32 ends with Jacob limping due to his dislocated hip, and the text goes on to explain that this is why the Israelites don't eat the tendon attached to the hip of any animal they ate. The text still refers to him as Jacob, as I said, and in the next lesson we'll see what happens when he meets Esau at last. But in this one, just to recap real quick, we've seen about the first of all, Jacob's ladder, as it's called, this stairway to heaven, and then how that changed him, and then his dealings with treacherous Laban over his desire to have Rachel as his wife, but instead he got her older sister, and he had worked 7 years for Rachel and all of that, and then all the drama that happened after that. So yes, it's complicated, and then of course this is going to go on. And then the last thing, of course, was the wrestling match, and you got to ask yourself, what was that all about? Why did God do that? But again, as we've seen here and there before in these lessons, God has reasons, and they aren't clear right away. And he doesn't always have to explain to people why things are being done, such as the near sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham. It was a type and a shadow. What the wrestling is all about, maybe we'll find out in later lessons, but right now it's pretty bizarre. But it's recorded faithfully, and it's things like that that remind me, at least, that the Bible is not a made-up story. Who would make up things like that. I mean, yeah, there are some pretty wild stories, but this one is written as matter-of-fact history, and it's not making the Jewish people look good. And that's the case throughout the whole Bible. It isn't written to make the Jews look good. And so why would the Jews write something that makes them look bad? It doesn't make sense. So again, next time we will go on to chapter 33 and the big meetup with Esau.